Welcome to today's Rental Skills webinar provided by our Maryland Realtors Affinity partner, RentSpree. As you registered for this event, you will receive an email next week which provides a link to the webinar on YouTube, the complete slide deck from today's presentation, and links to today's featured speaker. We encourage your questions. Please use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and questions will be answered at the appropriate time. At this time, I would like to introduce you to one of our colleagues at RentSpree, Stephen Pastores.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for our exclusive webinar today. We also have Leah, who is a customer success manager at RentSpree. Leah is going to be helping me answer the questions, so feel free to type any questions that you have into the Q&A box, and Leah will do her very best to get back to you as soon as possible. We're also going to leave some time for questions at the end of the training today. So that being said, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Slideshow here. All right, so today's webinar is titled 5 Essential Skills for Realtors Handling Rentals. RentSpree is a Maryland Realtors partner that provides online applications and tenant screening reports for rental properties. The goal of today's webinar is to help you save time, up to 90% more time on your next rental, while helping you understand ways to significantly reduce liability when working with rentals. We get a lot of questions when we work with realtors about rentals saying, is it really worth the investment? The thing about rentals is that versus a sale, there's comparatively less money to be made. And if you're spending a lot of time on a rental, there's not a lot of potential for you to get that ROI back. So it's really important when you're working with rentals that you have a set of technology tools in place that'll help you streamline the process. And that's really the goal of today's webinar, is to really help you understand ways in which rentals can be a cornerstone of your business if you're going about them the right way. So before this webinar, you may have a little bit of an understanding with rentals, but you're still trying to understand how to process the information that the renter is providing to you. You want to kind of understand how to develop a verification process so you can ensure that the renter is providing you with accurate data. You want to understand the legal requirements that go into making a rental decision. And you're also trying to learn a little bit more about the fair housing rules as they apply to rental properties. So after today's session, you're going to kind of have an idea of understanding rental information and what it means to you. You're going to have an easy strategy in place to verify applicant information. You're going to know the proper way to reject an applicant. And finally, you'll learn a couple of different ways to avoid those costly violations of the Fair Housing Act. So before we get started, I want to introduce myself again. So my name is Stephen Pastores. I'm the Customer Success Manager with RentSpree. I've given dozens of presentations and trained hundreds of agents all across the country. RentSpree is partners with Maryland Realtors, the California Association of Realtors, Florida Realtors, New Jersey Realtors, and much more. So we're super excited to provide you this content today. And let's get started with the presentation. As a quick disclaimer, the information that we're going to be presenting today is designed to be advisory only. So please do not consider this as a substitute for advice from a licensed landlord or tenant attorney. If you do have specific legal questions, please be sure to direct those to a licensed landlord or a tenant screening attorney as well. We're going to cover 5 different steps today, as mentioned in the webinar title. So the first is understanding how to read and interpret rental applications. Next, we're going to figure out how to verify applicant information when they're applying for a rental. We're going to next talk about different ways in which you can accept or deny tenants. We'll then discuss a couple of different ways for you to avoid fair housing violations. And finally, we'll develop a strategy for designing a standard screening process across the board for you. Once that's done, we'll have time for a couple of questions at the end of the session. Without further ado, let's start with skill number 1, reading a rental application. A rental application is one of the first ways in which you'll be introduced to a prospective tenant. So it's really critical for you to understand how to process all the data that the applicant is providing and how to interpret that data so you can make the best rental decision possible. Understanding how to interpret the data will make a huge difference in the service you're providing, and you'll end up with the best quality tenant. What's the purpose of a rental application? So obviously, you want to understand that this is a really great way for you to evaluate the applicant in comparison to other applicants. So if you're getting information on income, past residential history, and all the information looks good, this will help you evaluate if the applicant makes sense to be your future tenant. It's also useful for you to document information for later. So if you're working with a property that has a really popular listing and you're seeing a lot of applicants interested, you can only pick one applicant, but it's still really great to have those rental applications on file for everyone else, because those prospects could become future sales prospects down the road. So it's really great to have that data stored for future use. It's also helpful to have a rental application so you can cross-reference during the tenant screening process. So it's your responsibility to make sure that everything that the renter is providing to you is accurate. There's a couple of different ways you can verify the information, and having the application to look back to is a really critical step to make sure you're not making the wrong decision. The rental application consists of a couple of different components. So the first is the personal information. So the applicant will provide to you their name. If there's any proof of name change, they will provide that as well. Their SSN or passport number or driver's license number, any form of ID number, their anticipated move-in date, and if there will be other occupants living at the property. They will also provide to you their residential history. And this is important because you want to make sure that you're receiving not only the current address, but also any previous addresses of the applicant as well. Alongside that, they'll also be providing their landlord information and the rent amount that was paid at each of those addresses. They'll also be providing to you their current and previous employment history. So it's critical to understand that the applicant has a steady upward trajectory of employment and income, because this will ensure that they will be able to pay you the rent. Besides that, they will also provide a couple of different references, which can include employment contacts, landlords, but also friends or family members or former roommates as well. They'll also be providing pet information. So if they have a emotional support animal, things like that. And finally, any miscellaneous pieces of information, such as their car information, if they're a smoker, any bankruptcies and things like that. So all these pieces of data will be on the rental app that you'll have to verify later on. Now, common red flags on applications, there are a few of them, unfortunately. Even it's in this day and age where we're seeing a transition from paper applications to online applications. One of the first red flags that we encounter in the industry is incomplete applications, which can also include missing information. So what that means is that if a renter is in a rush to fill out the application, especially if they're doing a paper app, they'll miss sections, they'll submit everything, and then the agent or landlord will have to come back and remind them, hey, you missed a section, you have to put the signature on it all over again, and it's just a waste of time. So it's really important to have an application that has all the fields filled out. And that's one of the advantages of having an online application, because having an online application can help the renter identify sections that they might have missed, which will save time when it comes time to review the whole application itself. Another common red flag is, as I mentioned, is if the applicant is in a rush to move into the property. So they may rush through the application, and they may also ask you questions, such as, for example, if I just pay you a year's rent up front, can I be automatically considered to be your next tenant? Those kind of things, if the applicant is in a hasty mood to kind of get moving in and get things started, slow down a little bit and think twice about considering them to be your next tenant. Another red flag is if you can't get into contact with the applicant's references. So this is critical because there are a couple of different ways in which you can verify references, and those include email or phone. So if the applicant is providing to you incorrect email addresses and phone numbers, that's going to slow down the process, and it could possibly mean that they have something to hide. Another common red flag is if there are multiple co-applicants or occupants. So let's say, for example, you're renting out a 1-bedroom apartment and one applicant is applying, but they have a roommate that is also interested in living at the property. However, that roommate may not have the necessary credit or requirements to be considered to be your tenant, so they may actually apply under the sole applicant. So that's really important to make sure that you're collecting an application for every tenant who will be over the age of 18. And finally, another common red flag that we see is if there's no income or unverifiable income. So one of the ways to safeguard yourself against this is to make sure that you're collecting bank statements, pay stubs, tax returns, and things like that. All those documents will help you understand that the applicant has a steady history of revenue coming in. At the end of the day, this is all intended to help you save time and money so you can help focus on the bigger picture like a sales transaction. Moving on to skill number 2, verifying applicants. So we touched upon this a couple of slides ago. The renter is providing you with an application that is filled out by themselves. And this application has a lot of different data points that you're going to have to go back and cross-reference with once you're doing your screening. So it's important that you're providing this resource because it's going to be a value add to the landlord, right? So you're providing essentially to the landlord a curated list of applicants who meet the criteria, who have already been cross-referenced, and could readily be considered to be their next tenant. So this will help you also remove any problem applicants who don't have the necessary credit or who have criminal records and things like that, that will cause a landlord difficulty down the road. One of the main concerns that we see on applications is evictions. And this statistic really illustrates that. We're seeing 1 in 17 US households had an eviction filed between 2000 and 2016. Checking references and verifying information is a really crucial step to minimize the risk of an eviction. And especially now with the coronavirus pandemic, there has been an eviction moratorium. So it's important to make sure you're staying up to speed on the different regulations that may apply in your city and in your state and at the national level. So all those things may constantly change depending on how the trajectory of the pandemic goes. So make sure that you're staying on top of that news as well. It's also important to make sure that you're contacting a couple of different people throughout the application and screening process. So the first is to reach out to the applicant's current and previous employer. The employer will be able to answer a couple of different questions. So for example, they can verify the salary, they can confirm that the applicant has a steady history of coming to work on time, that they've been a reliable employee. You also want to make sure that you reach out to both the current and the previous employer, because again, you want to see that upward trajectory of income on their application. It's also critical to reach out to the current and previous landlord. And we also want to mention here that you also have to consider reaching out to the previous landlord, because for example, if it's a troublesome tenant, the current landlord may have a vested interest in just having that tenant leave their property and not have to worry about them. So if you verify not only the current, but also the previous landlord, you can get a complete picture of whether that applicant has maintained the property in good condition, if they paid the rent on time, and if they were just a good tenant in general. So it's again important to verify both the current and the previous landlord when you're reaching out. Kind of less important here are also the personal references. So try not to have them rely too much on friends or family. Ideally, you'd want to contact employers, also former roommates as well, just to ensure that the applicant paid rent on time and was, a good tenant to live with and things like that. It's also important to think about a couple of different ways to contact these individuals, which can be either through phone or email. Let's talk a little bit more about the reference checking. So we mentioned email and phone, and there's a couple of different pros and cons to each of these. One of the benefits of email is that you're likely to get a faster response, and it's easier for compliance purposes. One of the downsides is that there's increased fraud. So if the applicant provides an incorrect email or an email that belongs to somebody else, who's to say that that individual really is who they say they are? So that's something to watch out for. And one of the key tricks that you can use is if you're verifying employment, to make sure that the employer, when they reply back to your email, that they're using an official company address. So that's one of the ways you can safeguard yourself against fraud when you're verifying with the employer. Another risk of email is a low response. So in this day and age, a lot of email goes to spam, and a lot of landlords, employers are getting hundreds of emails every day. So it's important to make sure that you're getting a response if you're sending out emails or relying on emails exclusively as part of your strategy. Now, phone is a great alternative because reaching someone over the phone reduces the risk of fraud and also ensures higher accuracy. And one of the downsides, though, is it is more time consuming. So again, an individual may not pick up the phone as much this day and age. They may rely more so on email. However, if you are able to get a hold of someone, you can have a great conversation, and they can verify pretty much everything you need to in one fell swoop. So consider a strategy when you're doing reference checking that kind of blends these two strategies. Now, you may be wondering, what are some questions that I can ask the previous landlord? So there's a couple of different ways that they can answer these questions. And the questions that you see in italics are questions that are not yes or no questions. And these are critical because they can help you safeguard against fraud. So if the tenant is providing to you a fake landlord and all they have to do is answer yes or no questions, that's going to make their life a whole lot easier. However, if you add in questions such as what is the property address, how much was the rent, and what were the move in and move out dates, those are not yes or no questions, and it can really help you focus in on whether the landlord is actually the correct person or not. So again, the other questions, was rent paid on time? Was the applicant evicted? Those are standard yes or no questions that are very easy to answer. So make sure, again, as we mentioned in the previous slide, including both phone and email, when you're asking these questions, include both yes or no questions, but also questions that do require a more nuanced response. Now, when you're reaching out to the current employer, one of the main questions that you can ask is, what is the hourly or annual salary? So it's important to consider here that not every employee is paid on an hourly or annual basis. Some may rely solely on commission, or if they're an independent contractor, it's important to verify that as well. You also want to make sure that when you're calling the employer, is it the current employer, and what was the hire date for the employee. You also want to understand that the applicant has a stable track record. So if they've been promoted a couple of times over the past couple of years, that's generally a good sign because that means increased income. And another mention here about stability is if the applicant was full-time or part-time. So these are great questions to ask, but again, keep in mind that an applicant may be self-employed. So in that case, you may not have a live person to verify income other than the applicant themselves. So in this case, it's important to kind of dig a little bit deeper and get those tax returns, bank statements, and things like that that'll help you verify employment for those self-employed individuals. Now let's move on to skill number 3. which is accepting or rejecting applicants. You also want to make sure that you're understanding the requirements when you deny an applicant, which can help you protect yourself and your clients. So again, it's really important to have a set process in place when you're accepting or denying an applicant. And one of the considerations here is, do you have to tell rental applicants that they are denied? Now, according to the Fair Credit Reporting Act, you must provide an adverse action notice if the applicant is denied based on a tenant screening report. So for example, if you receive a tenant screening report back from an applicant and the report divulges that the applicant has multiple criminal records, and you deny the applicant based on the report, you must provide them with an adverse action notice. Now, in some cases, you may choose to accept an applicant on condition. So this also requires an adverse action notice if this decision was based partly or wholly on that screening report. One of the examples in which you may accept an applicant on condition is if they check off most of your criteria for the rental. So let's say if you require a minimum 650 credit score, but the applicant only has a 640. However, they check off most of your other requirements. You can provide a couple of different conditions for moving forward with that tenant. The first of these is requiring the applicant to have a co-signer, and this can be either a parent or guardian. If the applicant cannot meet income requirements on their own, this way you can have a backup plan with a person who does meet the requirements. You can also consider increasing the security deposit, which would be refunded at the conclusion of the lease. And then finally, another option would be to increase the rent amount to help mitigate the risk for the landlord. So there's a couple of different ways you can choose to move forward with an applicant who doesn't check off all your boxes, but they still have a reasonably well-rounded application package, and you do feel comfortable moving forward with them regardless. There's a couple of different requirements for these adverse action letters, which are based off those screening reports that I just mentioned. So the first would be to provide the reporting agency information. So this would be the name, address, and phone number of the screening company that was used to generate that report. You also want to provide a release of liability, which is a statement that the screening company themselves did not make the decision to accept or deny that applicant. You also want to provide the applicant with the ability to dispute. So in some cases, if an applicant shares a name with someone who has a criminal record, there may be a mistake that leads to them being denied based on information that is not tied to them. So you do want to give the applicant the benefit of the doubt here. If they're denied based on incorrect data, they want to have the ability to bring that up with the screening provider. And also, kind of tied to that point, is that you want to make sure that the applicant has access to a copy of their screening report if they request it within 60 days. Now, skill number 4 would be avoiding violations. One of the key pieces of legislation related to rentals is the Fair Housing Act. So you want to make sure that you're staying up to speed on this act to make sure that you and your clients are protected from any costly violations. I do want to preface this discussion with a quick overview of the Fair Housing Act violations and what the ramifications are financially. So the first offense of a violation is over $21,000. The second offense is over $52,000. And finally, the third offense is over $105,000. So these are really costly penalties if you're going about the screening and application process in a haphazard way. So it's really important to arm yourself with the tools necessary and make sure that you're making rental decisions fairly for every applicant involved. Now, what is the Fair Housing Act? So if you don't already know, this act exists to help safeguard protected classes from discrimination when a property is being sold or rented out. And the goal of the act is to ensure that housing is equally available to everyone, regardless of their race, color, sexual orientation, gender, religion, disability, family status, or national origin. Let's talk about some strategies to help you avoid these violations. And one of the key points that we want to mention is consistency. It's really important to make sure that every applicant is on a level playing field when applying for a rental property. This means that if you're charging an applicant $30 for a screening report, but you're charging a married couple $50, you're giving them a $10 discount because they're a married couple, but you're not treating everybody on an equal playing field. So that's one example of a potential violation. One way to avoid these violations is by using careful wording. So pay special attention to the wording that you're using in advertisements for your rentals. You want to make sure that you're staying away from language such as professionals only, no kids, no pets, things like that. You also want to avoid hot questions. And these questions relate to age, sex, religion, disability, and these should be really stayed away from, even if you're having just a casual conversation with your applicants. You also want to make sure that you're heeding service or support animals, and make sure not to ask about them during the screening process, and make sure especially not to deny outright a service or support animal, even if you have a no pet policy in place. And lastly, we're going to go into skill number 5, which is using a standard process. Putting it all together, we're going to quickly talk about ways in which RentSpree can help you provide useful resources to help you work with rentals quickly and effectively and safely. One of the benefits of using RentSpree is that you're having an online rental application always available. And again, one of the benefits of an online application is that you ensure that the applicant doesn't miss a step. So when an applicant is applying for a rental online, the application process will catch them if they miss any steps or any signatures, which will ensure that you're always getting a complete package back from the applicant. We also give you the option to verify references. We also ask for applicant authorization to share their information. And we also provide adverse action notices when it comes time to make a rental decision. If you haven't already used RentSpree or want to take the next step and get started, the first step would be to get a digital rental application for the applicants to fill out. Once the applicant submits, you'll get access to those industry-leading tenant screening reports within minutes. And one of the great benefits of using RentSpree as a member of Maryland Realtors is that there is no cost to you to use the service. So the only fee is the $30 fee, which is passed down to the applicants. And the applicants pay a $30 fee with a credit or debit card to submit their screening reports online. If you haven't already gotten started, it takes just 3 easy steps. So the first step would be to sign up for your RentSpree account in 2 minutes. And the only thing that we require of you is an email address and password. The next step would be to send a screening request to an applicant to get an application, credit report, criminal background check, and eviction report. And finally, you'll receive an email notification as soon as any reports have been submitted by applicants. And there is no downtime, which means you can collect screening reports and screen tenants 24/7, any day of the week. So before we turn it over to questions, I do want to share the URL for RentSpree, which is mdrealtor.rentspree.com. You can also access RentSpree directly from within Maryland Realtors. And again, this is a super easy tool to help you streamline your rental process. And it's really critical now, especially now that the busy summer season is coming up. So with that being said, thank you so much, everybody. And I do want to take some time for questions.
Let's see. So we had a couple questions. A lot of people were asking if the recording would be sent out, and it definitely will be. We also got a question about what can I do when identified references are not willing to provide their testimonies? So you may be limited in your ability to force a reference to respond. Whoever's making the rental decision should consider how this factors into his or her acceptance criteria. And we would advise consulting with a landlord attorney with specific questions on accepting or denying applicants based upon the reference information. But I think just to play it safe, I would just ask the applicant for an additional reference.
Absolutely, great point. And then just make sure when you're reaching out to references to have a diverse list. So employers, landlords, professionals, people who really can give you the full picture on the applicant.
Thanks, Stephen. We also had a question asking if RentSpree provides eviction letters. We don't provide eviction letters, but we do provide acceptance, denial, and acceptance on condition letters that are FRCA approved.
Correct.
Let's see. Got a couple different ones. Joan, I think I'm not familiar with case search. I'm not sure if Stephen is either, but we can look into that after the call.
We'll look into it.
These are some great questions. I think one of them also from Joan, does RentSpree allow applicants to see their credit report? Absolutely. The applicants can definitely view their credit report and see the same thing that you and the landlord are seeing. Alfonso asked, is there a script for phone reference calls? So there's not a script per se, but RentSpree actually does offer something in our RentSpree Pro package where we will automatically reach out to references for you. So we will send the reference that the applicant provided either a text message or an email based on the information, the contact info the applicant provided, and we will actually reach out for you, asking that reference to confirm or deny and add additional notes if needed, asking them if that information is correct or not. RentSpree Pro is free for the first month, and then after that it's $9.99 per month, but you can cancel it at any time. And yeah, it's a really great way to save time and all that back and forth by trying to contact the references. So we can definitely do that for you.
Absolutely.
Let's see. And then Lorena had just asked that same question. Is there an option to have RentSpree verify the employment references? So that is what RentSpree Pro will do. Let's see. Do we have to disclose why we turned on an applicant? Stephen, how would you?
Right. So yeah, going back to that, if a decision was made based off a tenant screening report, then yes, that would have to be disclosed.
Awesome. And then we have some other questions that are a little bit more detailed, but we can definitely take these answers and coordinate with Maryland Realtors and the rest of our colleagues to try to get you the most accurate answers possible. So we'll get back to you guys on all of these.
Absolutely. And I do want to thank Dan and Adrian for helping us coordinate the session today. It was really great to see all of you. Also thanks to Leah for helping with the Q&A. Again, as a quick reminder, we're going to be having this webinar recorded and it will be sent out to everyone after the session. And we will also do our very best to answer any questions that we couldn't get to at the end of the session today.
Okay.
Yeah, so we'll coordinate with Maryland Realtors, and they'll send the answers to hopefully all of these questions out in their recap message.
Okay, great. Thank you both so much. Thank you for attending today's webinar. Please make sure to sign up for our next webinar on April 1st, Succession Planning, moderated by our president, Dee Dee Miller. Register through the website banner on our homepage. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.